Let's then talk about verbal mimicry. Do we also mimic other people in terms of the words that they use, or in terms of the grammatical structures that they use, or in terms of the pitch that they use in their speech? The short answer is yes, we also mimic other people in terms of the words, the grammatical structures, the prosodic characteristics of the speech that they use. This is called verbal mimicry. And this verbal mimicry can be nicely illustrated by some examples. So imagine you're sitting in the lab as a participant, and the researcher asks you to describe the image that you see here. So if I ask you to describe this image in one sentence, maybe think about it for yourself for a minute. Well, how would you describe this image in one sentence? Probably what you will then say is something like, the man kicks the ball, right? And this is an active sentence. Remember from secondary school that this is an active sentence. You can call this an active sentence. And this is different from a passive sentence that you could also have produced. So you could also have said, the ball is kicked by the man, right? Perhaps more or less the same meaning, same image that you're describing. You're still perfectly well describing this image, but in a more passive way. This is a passive structure. Now, it turns out that in everyday life, people mostly use active sentences. It also works well when you're writing papers, for instance, to use active sentences. There are even those word processors that will tell you if you use too many passive sentences to start using more active sentences by underlining your passive structures. So in everyday life, we mostly use active sentences, but it turns out that if I start using passive sentences, all of a sudden, then at some point you will also start mimicking me and also using passive sentences more than you would naturally do. This is called syntactic priming. So I'm sort of priming your use of grammatical syntactic structures, such that if I start using a lot of passive sentences, like the ball is kicked by the man, at some point you will also start doing this. So this is a form of verbal mimicry. Well, this basic fact was then exploited by this study that's also on the reading list in a virtual environment. So what they basically did is they had participants play games with a virtual agent that you see here in this picture. So participants in the lab would be wearing this VR headset, and then they would be playing a game with this agent that you see here. And they would be describing pictures to this agent. And also this agent would be describing pictures to the participant. And then the question is, if now this agent all of a sudden starts using passive sentences, so the agent would see a picture of an image of a man that kicks a ball, and this agent would say, the ball was kicked by the man, or the ball is kicked by the man. Do you then, as a participant, when you're interacting, when you're playing this game with this virtual agent, are you then also at some point starting to use more passive sentences than you would naturally do? This is what they tested. And then they compared this to a situation where you would be playing the same game, or a different group of participants would be playing the same game, but then interacting with a real person. And then the question is, do we treat those virtual representations the same as how we treat actual people? And the short answer to that question is yes. So here in this graph, you see the proportion of passive responses, of passive sentences that participants produced. So sentences like the ball was kicked by the man. If they received an active prime, so if prior to that moment where they describe the picture, the virtual agent or the real person would use an active sentence, they wouldn't use too many passive sentences themselves, right? That's what you see to the left in the left part of this diagram. If you then look at the right part of the diagram, there you see that if the human or the human-like avatar would be priming you with a passive sentence, the number of passive sentences that you would use yourself would then also go up. So if the virtual agent or the real person says, the ball was kicked by the man, the chances that you would then describe the next picture also producing a passive sentence would go up compared to the active prime. And interestingly here, this is observed for both the human conversational partner and for the human-like avatar conversational partner. Notice that in this study, the question of whether they are interacting with an avatar or with a virtual agent is a bit unsure. They call it an avatar themselves. You could also say perhaps it's a virtual agent, but that's less important here. Most important thing here is that if you're primed by a human that uses more passive sentences, then you would typically expect you start using passive sentences yourself as well. That's this verbal mimicry, an example of this verbal mimicry. And apparently this works the same for human-like avatars. So you could again say people treat those human-like avatars more or less in the way they treat actual humans, which is interesting and nice. And then in this paper, you will read more about this. And you'll also read what happens when this avatar is not so human-like, when that avatar is not, for instance, having facial expressions that are very human-like, but is perhaps a bit more robotic. Do you then still see that people start mimicking this avatar, this virtual agent, if it's clearly a bit more robotic and if it's not very human-like? So, right, interesting observation. And again, a nice example of using virtual reality as an object, really studying how do people interact with virtual representations of people compared to how they typically interact outside of the lab, interacting with real people.